Hello, everyone. Welcome to the semi-weekly Tablas Creek Instagram live broadcast. I'm Jason Haas, of course, but I am not at the place that you would probably expect. I am not at the winery. I am instead on the other side of the country, in Vermont, where I grew up and where my mom still spends half the year, where my sister and her family are, and where we try to go back every summer to give our boys a chance to see that there are places where there's water that falls from the sky and it's green all summer. So anyway, if my backdrop does not look like the typical Paso Robles backdrop, there's a good reason for it. It is not the typical Paso Robles backdrop. So my guest this week is Kate Dingwall, who I think is one of the most exciting newish voices in the world of wine writing. Working right now. She's based in Toronto. If you haven't had a chance to read her stuff or meet her, well, today's your day. I will be inviting her on momentarily, but meanwhile, as I always do, I wanted to share some pictures as to what is going on at the winery. And these pictures were taken by Ian Consoli this morning. And the big story in the vineyard is that we have veraison. So let me show you, say, Grenache. So this is what Grenache looks like at the top of the hill. You can see it's not all the way through veraison. This is one of the more advanced Grenache clusters. So it's important to remember that veraison happens on a continuum with grapes happening earlier and later, and then high points, which are warmer, going through veraison earlier, low points that are cooler, taking a little bit longer. So compare that to a Grenache cluster, say, towards the bottom of the hill. You can see it's just barely getting started. If you want to look at a different grape, like something like Counoise, for example, you go to the bottom of a Counoise block, it looks like June still. And at the top of the block, you might see something that looks, I don't know, it's just starting. And then, of course, Syrah, which is an early grape, like top of the Syrah hill, almost looks like you're ready to harvest. Though if you look kind of under that canopy, you can see that there are some green grapes there in the background. So that's the story of what's going on in the vineyard. We are seeing veraison. We're less than halfway through, to be sure. I'll be writing a blog on it when I get back to California. So in a couple weeks, I'll share the whole story. Other things going on. We got some exciting stuff going on in the cellar. We have some new concrete tanks that are getting put in that we'll be able to use for harvest this year. I think that's going to be pretty exciting. We have our cellar intern started. That's Elena. She started there's a harvest intern who started 3 days ago. So we're already putting her to work. We have been blending the reds in the cellar. So we're blending the 2022 reds. We are also kicking off a new tasting in the tasting room. We posted about this on social media. It was last week. We started what we're calling the legacy tasting, which gives people a chance to taste some of the older wines that we've been cellaring. It also is a chance to dive into things like the panoply that we don't get to share very much. So it's kind of an elevated experience. And we have the opportunity, you can reserve it, or you can just tell us when you come. We have enough space, and the idea is a little bit like a tasting menu at a restaurant. We ask that your whole party do it if you're going to do it, but you can do it from any table, and you don't need to reserve it in advance. We do have information about it up on our website. And then finally, we are getting ready to release our first ever estate wine in a box. This is a chillable red called Alouette. It's 100% Grenache. I wrote about it on the blog last week, and I am so excited for it. I think it's just delicious. We are not putting it in bottles at all. It's just going into boxes and into kegs. Kegs for restaurants and wine bars, boxes for our direct customers. If you're on our mailing list, you'll get an email about it next week. So it's imminent. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to see if Kate is on here, and I am going to invite her to join. So hopefully this works as smoothly as it did during our test. So just sent the invite through, and we will...
There we go.
Magic.
Look at that, internet working.
Super cool. Technology is amazing when it works.
When it works.
So cool. Okay, so I gave people a very quick introduction. I'm not sure if you were watching right at the outset. that you are based in Toronto. You are one of the only writers I think I've talked to who is actively working as a som at the same time as you are doing your writing. So I think that's super cool. I want to get into that. But I'd love to start just by asking, can you talk about your path into wine? Was it something that was like on your family table growing up that you knew you wanted to do, or did you come to it later? How'd it happen?
So wine was something that was always very present growing up. And I think but I fell into it more in the way that most people who work in wine do. Like I started working in restaurants at a young age. And I have this very specific memory of being 16 and I was working in a restaurant and my job was to specifically pour water. I was not allowed to bus. I was not allowed to take orders. I was not allowed to do anything of actual importance but pour water. And I remember seeing the Somm, and I can say this because I'm still friends with him, and he was just flitting about doing what I thought was a whole lot of, he was like flirting with pretty ladies and pouring wine. And I'm like, he's making 4 times as much as me. How do I do that? And I started learning the wines on the list. And at 16, I had a lot of balls to do this. And I just started learning about wine and I was like, oh, this is actually very cool. And the more I would go into what even was on the basic resort wine list at the time, I was fascinated at just kind of like how it blended history and the difference that grapes, like different varietals of grapes could make. And it just made a lot of sense to me. So I started just digging into it. Once you're hooked, you can't really unhook. And as I grew older, I continued working in restaurants and veered more towards kind of bartending and working the floor as in a wine capacity. But I started pursuing writing specifically in fashion. I was in my late teens and early 20s, and I got a job at the fashion magazine, and I just loved it for the first few years. It was glamorous. I was working with like celebrities on international photo shoots and surrounded by very, very expensive clothing and writing about the hot new shoe, which was very fun when you're 21. But as that timeline progressed, a couple years in, I was sitting there and I'm like, I am worried about my impact on and consumerism. I feel like I'm not making I feel like my career isn't reflecting my own values. So I was at odds with that. And I eventually left the magazine and I was chatting with some friends who were editors and they were like, okay, all you talk about is beverage. Why aren't you writing about wine or spirits? You know a ton about it. And they started giving me easy, like, here are 10 whiskeys to write about. And I loved it. And it's something that took me way too long to commit to. I kind of floundered in fashion for a long time. But once I started writing, I was like, this makes a lot of sense. And 8 years later of kind of committing almost fully it took me a while to commit fully to writing about spirits. And it's still something I'm super, super excited about every day. And I find there's a lot to learn about and there's a lot to get excited about. And you can never know everything, which is a fun challenge for me.
100%. Absolutely 100%. So I'm curious, like, is there a wine that you first remember tasting and saying, like, oh, like, I get it. Like, yes, there's this story. Yes, there's these grapes, but like, I get it.
That's hard because my parents had good taste. So a lot, like a pretty high benchmark. We weren't digging into first growth or anything, but their table wines were not $2 chuck. And I think the things that really got me were just the lore and the history behind it. Like, oh, all these monks built these crazy vineyards closed by walls. What a weird thing. That's really fascinating. I was a big history nerd in high school. So I think connecting a lot of the art and culture things of wine, like it not just being a beverage that you kind of have a couple glasses of with your friends, it's a beverage that has just such intense historical and political and cultural impacts and is still such a connector of people. That got me. That's what really sunk me on wine.
So I'm curious, do you feel like the fact that you're working actively in restaurants still, like, do you feel like that impacts the way that you write about wine?
I think working in restaurants was the most valuable thing I've ever done for my writing career. It's even on a top level, like picking wines that aren't necessarily pushed by publicists and getting to taste alongside fantastic palates and learn from people who have been in the industry for ages and are actively involved with the consumer too is fascinating. And that's been and you also get immediate feedback from the consumer on what they're thinking of the wine. So in writing, I find writing and somm work is a lot different, very similar, but just different means of communication. In writing, I'm writing down what I pitch to the consumer, but I don't get to see what they think. Like, when you're pitching a wine to someone in a restaurant, you can immediately see their eyes glaze over if you're not picking the right buzzwords, if you're not describing the wine in the correct way. Like, and you get that immediate feedback, and it's such a valuable experience. I can be like, oh, I know I'm excited about this vineyard because of this elite, like elusive biodynamic practices or how they plant their vines and the orientation, but they don't really care. They want to hear what makes it cool. So it's great to have such immediate feedback, and that connection with the consumer is so valuable.
And do you feel like that changes the way that you write about things? Like knowing, oh, I tried this with a consumer and this didn't connect at all. Like, do I need to be speaking differently when I'm writing?
I think it makes me consider my own personal taste a lot more. There are some wines that I personally love and I've had in restaurants and tried to sell, and a lot of people are like, this is kind of weird or very esoteric and to my personal taste, which is great, but I needed to learn how to describe it as such or learn where it sits in the larger context of things and learn how, because the people who are reading these articles aren't just people who have my exact same taste. It's kind of figuring out what wines mean to different people and what tasting notes mean to different people and what regions mean to different people. Like, it's really interesting. It's valuable.
Totally fascinating. Yeah. And I'm actually, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you about a little later, but I think this is a good segue. It's like, what are your thoughts on the value of tasting notes? Like, are those things that you feel like are helpful, are universal, are a necessary evil, are a distraction? Like, where do you fall?
I'm always conflicted on my answer to this because I think some tasting notes from some critics are incredibly valuable because they're very considerate of the past and the present and the future of a winery and a region, and they have decades of valuable knowledge that they put into application when considering a wine. And that's something that takes decades of experience and knowledge and traveling and talking with producers. And that's all boiled down to 30 words or more. I also love tasting notes just to sometimes gauge my own palate. Like, what am I tasting? Am I way off base here? That's really valuable. But I also think a lot of people underestimate their own palate. If you don't like a wine, you don't like a wine. Like, you don't have to like a wine because it got 98 from whoever. Like, it's your own palate. Trust it. Find a wine you like. That the scores mean certain things to certain people, but if you're after the scores, find a critic whose palate you align with and maybe follow his or her direction, or just find a wine you like and stick to producers that are similar.
Yeah, I think that's good universal advice.
Mm.
The tasting notes piece, I mean, scores and tasting notes are a little bit different. Like, I feel like sometimes people, like, a score is pretty easy for people to understand, but it doesn't really tell them that much other than how much the writer likes something. Whereas a tasting note, like, could theoretically tell them more, but I find it's often like even more intimidating to someone because they're like, oh, I don't taste currants in this. In fact, like, I've never had a currant. Like, I don't know what that is. So I feel like there's certainly like some cultural challenges sometimes in translating what
Mm-hmm.
things taste like into words.
And what's an overripe gooseberry? That means very specific things to very specific people. And a lot of these tasting notes are very centered around a European palate, which is a very interesting thing to debunk.
Totally. So I'm curious, like, in your writing, what sorts of stories do you particularly like to tell?
So I've been writing for a while now. And at the beginning, I found I gravitated towards either wines that were put in front of me via in a restaurant setting and I got to meet the producer, or via a publicist, which is an interesting topic in wine because that means the winery probably has a big budget behind it. So I found myself over the last few years pushing myself to write about just cool people who are doing cool things, which is why I got into wine in the first place. Like people who are rewriting or writing a very special narrative, be it in their specific region, through their practices, how they're considering the future of the planet, which is something I'm very considerate about, and now increasingly considerate about in my writing because, well, we're in a climate, like we're approaching a climate crisis, and considering these things and supporting producers who are cognizant and doing what's best for the planet is something that I like feel a huge responsibility towards, especially as someone who's younger in the industry.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I love that answer. Is there like a favorite story you've gotten to tell, like one that you particularly want to highlight?
Okay, this was actually more controversial than I thought it would be, but that piece you and I worked together on alternative packaging, be it like the Tablas Creek boxes or uh, Bonnie Doon's fantastic like post-recycled material bottle with the uh, not plastic lining in there, or canned wines. I thought that was pretty like standard fare, but if you look through the comment section, people were super conflicted.
Huh.
I, I was really surprised at that. And I thought it was like, I think that's such an important conversation to have right now. And I truly think it's where the industry is headed. And a lot of people just weren't willing to try any wines in alternative packages, which I was surprised about. And that is a very conventional wine drinking audience. We probably know that exact wine drinker who's making those comments, but that was interesting to me because that was a story I was really excited about.
So interesting. I know when we first started making our wines in a box and announced it and marketed it, there were a handful of responses that we got that were essentially, I will never drink a wine that's not in a bottle. And
Yeah.
I'm always like, okay, great, I guess. But like, there's good reasons why you should probably reconsider that particular inherited bias. But we also had hundreds of people who bought boxes from us who told us like, I've never bought a box of wine before.
Mhm.
Like, how does it work? Like, how do you get the spout out? Like, how does like, and the sort of discovery that people had of how easy it was and how cool it actually was to have something that you can just pour a glass of in your fridge was also pretty cool to see. So hopefully that piece changed some hearts and minds.
Yeah, and I think people are, well, they're opening up their minds to it. And I think it's a bit of a, hey, try it once and you'll be sold conversation. But yeah, most of the feedback I was reading through was, oh, I've never tried it and I never want to. Like, okay.
Okay, great.
Cool.
Thank you for reading all the way to the end. Like, thank you for reading all the way to the end and leaving this comment. Like, okay.
Okay, yeah, exactly.
So you've written for a lot of different publications. I mean, I have a partial list here. I think like Wine Enthusiast, Forbes, Food and Wine, Maxim, Vintner Project, Toronto Life, Toronto Star. Did I miss any? 750. How do you choose outlets to work with?
So most of those outlets I've actually been writing for at least 3 at the minimum, 6 at the maximum years. And it's pretty nice once you get started with a publication. For background, you kind of have to pitch a publication blind. Just send them a nice email saying, hey, I'm Kate. Like, I'm a nice writer. Here's my ideas. Would you like to work with me? And thankfully, all of those publications said yes. And then you just have to kind of send your articles in on time and be nice to work with. And thankfully, all my editors at all of those publications are fantastic people, whip smart editors, and just really nice to work with.
Yeah.
So it's been
I love working.
Relationship.
I mean, I do most of my writing unedited. It's mostly stuff that we publish on the Tablas Creek blog, but the handful of times I've gotten to work with an editor is such a revelation.
Yeah.
I remember
Humbling.
I can't remember who I was talking to. I was talking to a writer who both wrote for a bunch of like like professional outlets and also had her own piece. And she said that she always felt like writing without an editor was like rock climbing without ropes. Like she just felt like there was so much risk in doing it.
And often I'll get pieces back from an editor and they'll point out something that's wildly obvious. And I had read that piece 7 to 8 times before sending it to them, and I had still missed it. So even those tiny things, like, ooh, okay, you are worth every single penny this magazine pays you.
Awesome. So I'm curious, are there writers like either in wine or outside of wine who you particularly admire or love to read or um, try to like not emulate necessarily, but like pick up ideas from?
I think what Sam Cole Johnson is doing with her video work is brilliant. She captures the news very well, and we're in the time where wine media is changing quite a bit. We're seeing publications unfortunately shut down their print movements. We don't really know where the incoming generations are, how the incoming generations are going to interact with wine and wine media. Kind of touching back on what we mentioned earlier, scores are something that younger drinkers aren't gravitating towards, they don't resonate with. And I think what Sam's doing with how she rethinks formats to share our industry in such a tangible, exciting way is really brilliant. She's great.
I agree with that 1,000%. And that anybody who is not watching that either on her own handle or on the Jancis Robinson
Mm-hmm.
handle, like if you care about what's going on in the world of wine, like 5 minutes a week, she distills it down. It is money.
It's absolute money.
Um, so I'm guessing that a lot of our viewers probably don't know much about what the Toronto wine scene is like. Can you take us inside it a little bit?
So I moved back to Toronto in 2019 because from New York because I lost my American visa. Thank you, Trump. So I kind of didn't really know what to expect. My parents lived nearby. It was a major city. I had a passport to Canada. So you know what? I moved back to Toronto, unfortunately, right before the pandemic. But I've been really pleasantly surprised. It has a really passionate wine scene and one that's heavily rooted in small businesses and small wine production, whether it's producers from further afield, odd areas, or we have a lot of wine regions within Canada, and there's a lot of support for that. So there's a lot of independent wine bar, tons of independent wine bars, and lots opening up every day. And there's a really tight knit community. So we've got a big city feel to our actual brick and mortar space, and then we've also got this fantastic, but we're a small enough city that there's a real community. A lot of people know each other. We support each other. We go to our friends' bars. We go to our friends' bottle shops and buy from there. So it's a really warming city. I really am enjoying being part of the community.
That's great.
And there's great area wines if you're ever, unfortunately not a lot get exported to the United States, but it's well worth searching for.
Yeah, that was really driven home to me when I was in Montreal this January for the Tasting Climate Change conference, and there were kind of regional tables of like the wines of Quebec and the wines of Ontario and a whole bunch of producers who were there who we never see in the States. I mean, we see a few wines from BC and California, and that's pretty much it. And there was a lot of really cool stuff that I got a chance to try.
Yeah, and we're still a relatively young wine region. So a lot of stuff is really experimental, kind of seeing what's going on and defining ourselves. So I think it's a really exciting moment in Ontario's wine history. So it's exciting to be a part of that too, and just kind of guess where things are going.
I bet. So this sort of segues into another question that I wanted to ask, and I'd love you to maybe answer in like two parts, and that is if there are like regions or categories of wine that you think are flying under the radar that are particularly exciting. And I guess the two parts are, I would love at least like something about what's happening in Canada as one of the answers for that, and then beyond that, elsewhere in the world, or if there's anything like that, I'd love to know that too.
That's an interesting question because I feel like my fascination lies with where whatever region or part of the industry I'm researching at the moment. So I've been working on New Zealand Pinot Noir over the last week for a feature, and that was just really cool to see what's happening there. I've never been over there, so it was exciting to dig into, and which I think goes back to my general fascination with the industry. There's always something happening and always things going on. That said, I got to go to the Loire a couple of weeks ago and hang out with Nicolas Joly, which was just like so cool and such a bucket list. And I really like geeked out and got really unprofessionally nerdy about it all. Fantastic. But um, back to your initial question. Okay, second part. Okay, what did I miss?
So it's basically like if there are regions or categories that you think are particularly exciting in Canada or out of Canada that you've been sort of into recently.
It's interesting because I think with the globalization of the wine industry over the last 10-ish years, we have so much access to wines from around the world. So all of a sudden you can drink tiny, tiny Portuguese producers, or I have had a lot of really good, a lot of interesting Armenian wines recently. And there's so much access to information and new producers and new styles that we're the industry is changing at a hugely rapid rate. So that's been fascinating for me to just drink through new regions. I'm also super excited by the alternative packaging category. Like again, climate change is something that feels like it's looming quite drastically. So seeing producers actively think about things is something I feel very inclined to support. And I've had a lot of really fantastic wine in canned boxes, so that's something I'm like just excited to see continue.
Were there any of of those alternative packages that you found in the research for that article that you were like, I've never seen this before? Like, why are more people not doing this?
Hmm, that's a good question. I feel like the smaller format boxes, the ones that are 1.5 liters, was very smart. Small format, like smaller footprint, not as intimidating a purchasing decision as the larger boxes. And I think that's one of the issues with the box wine category is getting those people indoctrinated very quickly. So those smaller format boxes just made a lot of sense to me. I think like the Ami folks are doing that, and Alaleo is the other one doing that. Sorry, that took me a second. So that was really intriguing. And I'm interested to see how the variety of cans shake out. We have the traditional pop can size, but that's like half a bottle of wine. I remember drinking one of those in the park recently. I'm like, oh, I should go home. Like, this is more wine than I thought it was. I kind of thought it would be around, in my brain, it was the same like percentage as a beer, but no, no, no. So I'm interested to see where we land with different can sizes.
Yeah, it feels to me like the 250 ml cans are probably like that's probably a more reasonable size for most people. It's a couple glasses. Yeah, the whatever the full size cans are in fact half a bottle of wine.
Yeah, you forget that, and then you have a very fun walk home.
um, cool. So, do you have any upcoming projects that you can share? I mean, I realize there may be things you can't share, but anything that you're excited about going forward?
I'm at it. That's a good question because I'm at an interesting point in my career. I've kind of been writing long enough that I'm starting to have notoriety within my publications. And I've been sitting with the concept of what's next. Do I lean into a Substack? Do I go the book route? I'm at that kind of career, that point in my career where I consider what the rest of it looks like. Do I get into speaking? Probably not, because I make too many weird jokes. Like, so I'm trying to see what that looks like, which is really exciting and probably a bit intimidated, but I'm trying not to let that get to me. But I'm committed to wine at this point, and I love the industry, and I'm very excited about it. And writing has been fruitful for me over the last few years. So I'm toying with ideas. So that hints to absolutely nothing because I have no answer for you.
I think that basically is stay tuned.
Stay tuned. I am also staying tuned.
Awesome. Well, I cannot believe that it has been a half an hour, but it has been a half an hour already. And I do try to keep these to a half an hour because you're already donating a chunk out of your afternoon. So thank you so much for joining me. Before we go, can you share what the best way is for people who want to follow you and read the things that you do and find out what that next chapter looks like? How should they do that?
My Instagram is the most active I also double as a photographer, so there is always lovely film photography of different wine regions and foods and wines on there as well. And I also link out my articles on at least a bi-weekly basis. So that's a great place to see what I'm up to.
Awesome. Cool. Well, Kate, thank you so much for joining me. And I hope you have a good end of the summer.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's great to chat, and yeah, enjoy your holiday.
Thank you. I will. I mean, who would not enjoy that?
Oh, that's pretty nice.
Pretty gorgeous and pretty different from Paso Robles. I'll take it. Cool.
All right.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everybody who joined. I will be back in 2 weeks. My guest in 2 weeks will be Antonio Galloni, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of Vinous, which is one of the most important of the review and article journals. So that should be fun. So thanks again. Thank you, Kate. See you all in a couple of